Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for our Family Life Enrichment series. We are excited that you have taken the time over the last couple of Wednesdays to join with us and to give us some feedback on the sessions that we've done so far. We want to thank you for the time that you are spending with us. We want you to know that our Family Life Enrichment series comes compliments of the Church of God Barbados. Our chairman, the Reverend Vasco Perry, is excited to welcome all of you to these wonderful sessions where we're able to get together and look at various aspects of life, various aspects of family life. And again, I want to thank you so much. I'm Pastor Lennox Boyce, and I'm excited to be your host this evening. I'm doubly excited to be able to welcome our special guest, David S.R. Johnson, who is going to be presenting this evening on the whole idea of mental health. And I know that this is a topic which in the past was a taboo subject, but I know that as enlightened people, that we have greater appreciation for all aspects of mental health. And so I just want to maximize our time and go right ahead and welcome our special guest this evening. So David Johnson is a 24-year-old medical student and the president of Let's Unpack It. He is best known for his tireless advocacy in the Caribbean mental health space, as well as his passion for youth empowerment. David is a regular presenter at youth development workshops and wellness seminars, and makes frequent appearances in the media to speak on all matters regarding youth mental health. He envisions a Caribbean region where every citizen can enjoy their right to the highest attainable standards of holistic health and wellness. On the wards and through his advocacy, he applies his efforts to make this vision a reality. David, I want to welcome you this evening to our space and to let you know that we are very, very, very excited to have you come and to have you share with us. We just want to let you know that David is going to present, and then we are going to take some questions at the end. So our technical team will be chatting with you on YouTube and giving you some instructions as we go through this session. But we are so happy to have you, David, come and join with us this evening.
Thanks so much, Pastor Boyce. It's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Thanks so much to the chairing committee for welcoming me and for giving me the pleasure to share on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm really looking forward to a level of engagement with you in the chat. And I am looking forward to some of the questions that you will have afterwards. So the presentation for this evening, entitled, aptly so, Mental Health Under the Microscope. And I wanted to start this conversation by just giving you a quick disclaimer that this content, like we mentioned, mental health, is particularly sensitive, and we will be discussing some things including self-harm, substance misuse, and suicide. And if any of these topics will be particularly triggering for you or harm your mental health in any way, I asked you not to engage with this particular presentation. Of course, this content as well is for educational purposes only. I am not a physician as yet. I'm not able to offer any diagnoses for anyone. But I do encourage you that if you are experiencing any kind of negative thoughts, if you're experiencing any kind of mental health challenges, that there is help available. And I will ask the technical team to share that link in the chat so that everyone can have access to a full list of helpful resources. So these disclaimers out of the way, I really want to set the tone by kind of showing you what is going to be our outline for today. And there are really just 3 points that I want to convince you of by the end of this session. Number one is that your mental health is much more than the presence or absence of a mental illness or a mental health condition. Number two is that your mental well-being is crucial to your overall well-being. And then thirdly, that if you are intentional about your mental well-being, we can definitely work towards reducing poor mental health outcomes. Yeah, so let's dive right into the discussion. And you're probably wondering, what is this weird photo that I've just put up on the screen? I promise you it was not an accident, right? So everyone who knows me well knows that I really enjoy life in the outdoors. I really enjoy hiking and exploring and anything to do with moving my feet, honestly. And perhaps I will say that that is due to my 7 years of a tenure, really, in the Barbados Cadet Corps. And what this picture is my very first hike briefing. So everyone is familiar with cadets. We know that cadets do a lot in terms of training. And one of the core features that we do is a lot of orienteering and hiking. And so this was my very first hike all the way back in first form. I hardly remember that guy sitting there right now. But you'll notice that there are quite a few things happening in this photo. Number one is that you see me dressed in that field wear. Number two, you see a very confused look on my face. And number three, you see this weird thing on my back, a hiking bag that is completely empty at this point. But at some point later on, it's going to become full, right? And so what we're doing here is sitting down for a hiking briefing. And we're getting told all these things about how do we prepare for the hike? What happens if something goes wrong? What do you do if you get lost? You know, what stuff should you put into your bag? What stuff should you leave out? You know, how much weight are you expected to carry? And this is a lot of information for an 11-year-old to process in advance of one hike. And why am I telling you this information? Well, I want to compare life, the life journey, to going on a hike, right? And I want you to imagine that the bag that you're going to carry on this hike is your mind, and that the stuff that you're going to put into that bag reflects life stress. And mental health itself is the capacity that you have to carry that weight and keep on hiking. And if you take nothing else away from this presentation, this is the slide that I want you to remember, that life is a hike. And this is the journey that we're going on today. And what I'm offering you today is the briefing for this hike. Yes? So join me, will you? So I said just now that mental health is akin to the capacity to carry that hiking bag, right? But in more complicated terms, or what the definitions that we would use within the medical field, is that mental health is a state of well-being that enables a person to recognize their abilities, to cope with the normal stresses of life, to learn well, to work well, to maintain healthy relationships, and make positive contributions to their community. And what all of that really means is that mental health really relates to your emotional, your psychological, and your social well-being. And there are quite a few things that I want to point out from this definition to help us all appreciate mental health a little bit more deeply. So number one is that the definition says it's a state of mental well-being, right? That enables a person. So the first thing that we start to appreciate here is that we all have mental well-being. And if that is one thing that I hope that you can, take note of, that would be great. Because walking away from here, I want everyone to appreciate that to start with, we all have mental well-being. And what the word state kind of implies is that mental well-being shifts and it exists on a spectrum. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. But in addition, what you will note from this definition is that there's no mention of the word illness. There's no mention of the word disorder. And so commonly when we talk about mental health, people often think of disorders. They often think of someone acting a certain way or, engaging in a particular behavior that seems a bit abnormal or weird, right? But what this definition is offering us is that mental health is a lot more than just the presence or absence of illness. So much so that the word illness does not even get a mention in the definition, right? And so the other thing that I want you to kind of recognize as well is that your mental well-being affects a number of other things, right? And so it's very important that we can maintain a level of optimum functioning and optimal well-being so that we can engage in the normal activities that bring us joy, that help us to be productive and help us to build healthy relationships with others. Yes. And so going back to the analogy that I drew for you a little earlier, mental health in terms of coping with these normal stresses of life is really that capacity to carry the weight of life's stressors, right? So we move on. Right. So just now we mentioned the idea that mental well-being exists on a spectrum. And all that means is similar to height. We all know that we all have height, but height comes in different varieties. And so some people may say that I am short. Some people may say I'm average. Some people may say I'm extremely tall, right? Mental well-being kind of exists on that similar kind of spectrum, ranging from healthy to ill. And so for the majority of people, they're usually in this area of green and yellow, where we term healthy and reacting. So when we utilize the term mental health, what we're talking about is normal mental well-being, normal mental functioning, right? So what do we see with this? We see normal mood fluctuations. So you face a normal life challenge, you adapt, you're able to roll over and have a good sense of humor about it. And you don't let these stressors kind of take you away from your level of productivity and optimum functioning, right? You're able to maintain normal sleep patterns. You don't have many difficulties in terms of finding rest, in terms of maintaining everyday functioning. And you're really just feeling at your best. Now, what can happen here is that you can be in a normal state for a protracted period of time, but then something happens. Some particular stressor happens, some particular trigger happens. And then you get into that phase where we call reacting. And this is really where you can have that common and reversible level of distress. So you might have got some bad news today, this morning, and you woke up feeling well, but then you got that bad news and it feels like your day is going to be ruined, right? And so what do you feel? You get a little agitated, you get nervous, you may cry, you may feel it as if you don't really want to go to work on this particular day, right? But you're still able to some extent to function. You may have some level of difficulty with sleeping that particular evening. You may feel like you're not really at your best. And perhaps this may even extend over a period of a week, for instance, where your mood is just not that great. But you feel that if you reach out to someone and if you talk about it, then you'll be able to function, you'll be able to cope. And so this is still a very normal area in where we can say, okay, self-care and social support can help me in this particular instance and to help me to get back into that green zone. But there comes such a time where you feel as though you're not really coping that well. And talking with someone else may not be helping that much. And so this is where you can get into that orange and that red zone where we can term these as poor mental health. So one of the common misconceptions that we have, particularly within the Caribbean society, is that when we say somebody has poor mental health, it means that they have a mental illness. That's not necessarily the case. And we'll go through a few examples later to show you what are some of the key differences. But what's important to note is that when you're in this orange and red zone, you're injured or ill in terms of mental well-being, this is where you really want to consider seeking professional help, right? In the form of a counselor, in the form of a therapist, in the form of some other mental health professional, or even your general practitioner, right? And so there's some cardinal signs that you will see here in terms of the effects that they will have on mental well-being, on one's mental health, or one's state of mental wellness. But we'll go through these in a bit more detail as we go on to the future slides. Yeah. So yeah, let's get back to the story about that particular briefing. And one of the things that really stood out to me in this particular briefing was that they told us a lot about strategizing, a lot about what do you take on that journey with you? And so one of the things that really stood out here was that we got to choose what we would put in, but then there were some other things that were added for us, things that were necessities, things that we had no choice over. So things like your mess tin, a certain level of food that was allocated, even your water bottle. And they told us, even in terms of managing the load, that you have to realize there are things that you might think you need that you won't actually need in the field. And so something like water, when you're on the first day or the day of preparation for a hike, you don't consider that, I only need so much water. So they gave us one water carton, and some of us thought that that was not going to be enough. We didn't consider the fact that along the way there will be stops where you could replenish the water, because of course this was our very first hike. We had no clue what to expect. But what was something that was, kind of highlighted for us is that something that is even as essential as water could actually be additional load that you have to bear. Again, something that you don't think about. But I say all of this to show you that what you put into your bag actually matters. And going back to the analogy that your bag actually reflects your mind, it's really important that we manage well what we put into our bag so that we have that capacity to carry it, right? So let's explore this a little bit about what is some of the stuff that goes into the bag again being the mind, right? So the things that we don't choose, and these are the things that will affect one's mental health, one's mental well-being. So individual and biological factors, things like your genetics, you have no control over it. You had two parents, they made you, and you were blessed with the particular genetics that you have. Yes. Of course, your brain chemistry. When we talk about brain chemistry, we're talking about chemicals like neurotransmitters, things like dopamine and how those receptors function, things like serotonin, what you would know as your happy hormones, right? They're different conditions which can affect the level of chemistry or the level of balance of these particular chemicals, and they can have certain mental health implications. Of course, if unfortunately you were injured or you got into a particular accident that caused some degree of damage to your brain, that could have some level of impact as well on your mental health and wellness. So these are individual and biological factors that you really have no control over. Some other things that we didn't choose or that we don't choose to actively put into our mind may include social and structural factors as well as life experiences. So what do I mean by social and structural factors? These are the things that include interacting with others, or things that happen through a process of socialization, or things that people may refer to as the system that have some level of impact on your mental health. So, your upbringing, the way that your parents raise you, the way that they handle stress, the way that they model certain behavior for you can have an impact on your degree or capacity to cope and to deal with mental challenges as they arise. Perhaps you didn't have that great of a childhood. Things like childhood neglect and exposure to abuse very early on in childhood have been correlated to a level of poor mental health and mental illness during adulthood. Things like poverty and stigma and discrimination, which we know to be quite common social phenomenon, are again impacting on one's mental wellness. So take for instance someone not able to afford access to mental health care, someone who may not be able to put food on their table or may not have access to the level of services and goods and needs to help them to enjoy a high quality of life. This can have a detrimental impact on one's mental health. Of course, exposure to violence as well has a correlation to one's mental state. And then, of course, we can think of things like geopolitical unrest. We are very fortunate in the Caribbean in the sense that we do not have a level of instability in terms of our politics. But there are some regions in the world where all people have known is conflict and war. And growing up in that kind of situation where you're not able to freely roam, where you're not able to, go and freely enjoy yourself and enjoy activities that are required for the rest of us in terms of wellness. Something as simple as getting out into nature, taking a walk in the park, you know, just freely reading your Bible, for instance. These are things that other people do not have access to, and kind of also affect their overall mental state. So very important to note. The other thing here is life experiences. So I know that there are a number of things here that we can all relate to. And so if you've ever been wondering if these things can impact your mental health, absolutely they can. So for instance, what we've experienced over the last 5 years in terms of a increasing prevalence of natural disasters and adverse weather events, the rollover impacts of the climate crisis can have a level of impact on mental health. You'll hear frequent terms now like climate despair and climate anxiety, which is really prevalent, particularly around young people, having been exposed to a number of adverse weather events and adverse effects of climate change within their lifetime and not knowing what the future might look like. Of course, things like job loss and unemployment, homelessness, debt, grief, trauma, abuse, stress, and of course, disability can also impact one's mental state. So these three categories are things that we didn't choose. But then there are things that we can choose, which can have a detrimental impact on our capacity to carry the weight of life stressors. And these things include lifestyle factors. And there are a few listed here, things like diet, one's level of physical activity, of course, substance use, and then one's degree of coping skills. And we'll touch on coping skills a little later. But I also put the water bottle here on the slide to remind you that sometimes there are things that we don't choose, things that come innately to us that can have or an impact on our mental health and well-being, and we need to be conscious of that. For instance, something like exposure to early childhood trauma and abuse. These are things that you may become more acutely aware of within your adulthood. And so this is something that you can reach out and get help with. This is something that you can talk through. This is something that while you may not be able to fundamentally change that reality, you can learn how to cope and how to manage your behavior and manage your response moving forward. Yep. So I wanted to show you this very basic mental well-being algorithm to kind of put everything that we've discussed so far into context, right? And so basic left to right viewing of this algorithm. On the left, we have inputs. In the middle, we have this kind of, corroboration and really processing of these inputs. And then we have an output. So on the left, these are things like the factors that I just talked about, your early experience, your childhood, your upbringing, your socialization experience. Then, of course, things like triggers or conflicts, the natural disasters, the stress, the death of a loved one, sudden loss of a job, things like that. And then, of course, your beliefs or your assumptions can also come into play here. And what all of these things actually combine in terms of input, they get into your mind, go into your brain, and your brain is really responsible for planning and execution of the things that we see to the right. So your behavior modulation, your personality expression, your ability to think clearly and make rational decisions, the way that you interact with others and the way that you control or you lose control over urges and thoughts, everything here mentioned in this middle portion is controlled by your brain. And so you can imagine here that the brain is a very, very important organ, not only in terms of controlling physical wellness and the physical functioning and biochemical functioning of your body, but it also is really responsible for making the decisions, the way that you think, the way that you behave, and the way that you feel as well. And so it's really important that we seek to prioritize mental health just as much as we prioritize our physical health, because again, the brain is really responsible for these kind of things and really responsible for the level of output that we'll discuss now. So there are really three kind of key outputs from the brain. as it relates to mental health and well-being. So number one is your mood or affect. More of us are familiar with the term mood, which relates to how one feels. Affect kind of has to do with one's display of that, right? And so there are times where these two things may not correlate. You might think of, for instance, someone who is sad but is really good at bottling it up, and so their affect appears normal, right? But really on the inside, they're not feeling that great. And so, really, mood is something that is subjective and experience. Affect is really what somebody else may see. And so, this is something that your brain controls. Of course, your thoughts are an output or a response to a particular trigger. So, you may have positive thoughts, you may have negative thoughts, you may be confused, you may be having particularly intrusive thoughts, or you may be having no thoughts at all. You may be having blocking, right? So these are things that we can have a level of response in terms of the triggers as well. And then finally, behavior. So behavior can be described in several ways. And so, like I mentioned before, when we think of mental health, oftentimes we think of extreme behavior. We think of violence and aggression. We think of someone who just doesn't seem right in the head. These are some of the behaviors that we tend to link to. But on the flip side, mental health can also have, in terms of one's behavior, it can be healthy behavior. It can be behavior that is normal. And so that is a reflection of your mental health and your mental state, something that we don't often think about. But something else to consider here in terms of behavior is one's capacity to cope, like we've been mentioning over and over in the previous slides. Your degree, in terms of your degree of being able to manage or respond effectively to a particular trigger is always informed by your degree of coping. So, do you have the appropriate coping mechanisms? If you have the effective coping mechanisms, are you actually applying them? Do you feel motivated to apply them? Right. And so, one of the common things we hear people say is that I don't want to go to a therapist because I don't think they'll be able to solve my problem. Or I don't want to go to counseling because I don't think they're going to tell me anything new. Right. But what we often miss when we say that kind of thing is that therapists, counselors, mental health practitioners are trained in terms of teaching people how to cope. And so some of these behaviors are not innate to us, right? You don't come out of the womb thinking, when I get stressed, I'm just going to breathe, or I'm just going to plant my feet on the ground and ground myself, right? These are not things that you come out of the womb knowing, right? These are things that are taught and are learned. And it speaks as well, generally, to the idea that we can modulate and control our response. And so, while yes, your brain is the driver of some of these responses, there's a lot that we can do as individuals to kind of train our brain, train our response, and manage that level of response as well. So that's a really basic mental health or mental well-being algorithm. And I want to apply or overlay on this the COVID-19 pandemic experience. So let's do that. I know, don't really mean to trigger anyone, don't mean to discuss all of this bad news, but I think really important to drive home the point here about what mental health actually is, to really show you an example that we can all relate to. So in terms of the experience of COVID, I think we can all relate to the fact that COVID-19 was a major trigger. And like it or not, we were all impacted somehow psychologically, whether that was through stress, whether that was through just feeling very low, feeling a sense of anxiety and fear, or feeling just despondent, right? We were all triggered to some extent by COVID-19. And you can imagine that for those who were already living with particular mental health conditions or mental illnesses, COVID-19 actually reflected as a multiplier or a threat multiplier for these individuals, effectively then exacerbating the challenges that they were facing. And so if we're going to apply this or overlay this on the algorithms that I just presented, what were the inputs, right? So the inputs were disruption of life, disrupted health services, loss of income, death, social distancing, and of course, the erosion of support systems. These all reflect conflicts or triggers or stressors, effectively, which were being added to the bag, right? And so your brain had to manage all of that. And for many of us, this was the very first time that we experienced something so stressful, certainly at this particular scale. And so, what were some of the outputs or what were some of the responses that we had to that in terms of our mood, our thoughts, and our behaviors? So, in terms of our mood, I think most people would say they were extremely stressed, extremely worried, extremely sad, or some may even say that I was extremely depressed, being isolated for so long, right? What were some of the thoughts that we were having? I think for me, the thought was, when is this going to end, right? Are we ever going to get out of this? Am I ever going to see my friends again? Am I ever going to be reconnected with my support system again? And I think overwhelmingly, there was just this spirit of negative thought. There was very little good to see within that particular situation. And this, of course, was not helped by the fact that we were being overloaded constantly with data, with constant bad news, and with this algorithm or this, database of information regarding deaths and rates of contraction of the illness, etc. Right? And so, what did this do to our behavior? For some people, being isolated for that protracted period of time, losing their job, or having to be socially distanced and not being able to be connected to their friends actually resulted in a level of social withdrawal, right? The helplessness that you felt, even though, yes, you were socially isolated or distanced rather, it felt as though there was no room for connection. And so there were a lot of people who bottled up, which may have been a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your situation, in terms of focusing on yourself and building time for self-care and getting the rest and so on. That's good. But the negative side now of it is much rather the fact that some people felt very depressed, and that resulted in behaviors such as, not eating well, not sleeping well, or not coping overall very well. So you can see there how we applied that particular situation. But I want to share with you what were some of the broader impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here are a few on the slide. Number one, well documented that there was widespread psychological distress, which is really often expected with any event of this scale. So this doesn't apply only to COVID-19, it applies to natural disasters. So Hurricane Maria, the freak storm, the fact that, in the midst of this COVID-19 environment, we also had a whole volcanic eruption that caused Barbados to be under darkness for a protracted period of time. This would have resulted in some level of psychological distress, right? One of the other well-documented ideas, in fact, most recently, the Surgeon General out of the United States also published a warning on this in terms of the onset of a loneliness and isolation epidemic, particularly around young people, being, having to stay home from school for that protracted period of time, not being able to build such good social skills within that period of time that would ordinarily take place within a school environment. A lot of young people became very isolated, very disconnected, and started to grapple with things like depression and severe loneliness, right? In addition, what COVID-19 also resulted in was that everyone had to stay home. And that often meant that people staying home had to stay in sometimes very tense environments. Not everyone is fortunate to have families that gel really well. And so what COVID-19 created was an atmosphere for tension, for abuse, and it was actually well documented that approximately 45% of women experienced some level of domestic violence within year one of the pandemic. Very gruesome and very concerning as well. And you can see here how that can have a correlation in terms of stress, in terms of abuse, in terms of exposure to violence, having that kind of impact on one's mental health and the propensity to have mental illness down the line as well. But of course, one of the other major issues that we had with COVID was that there was a severe disruption of mental health services. In Barbados, it was very evident that there was no clear plan on how to approach mental health, right? And so everyone was left to their own devices, or everyone was left to form their own support groups, which is not a bad thing. But it's really important that moving forward, we can have the kind of action, the kind of literacy, the kind of awareness, and the kind of plan that in the eventuality of another disaster, we all know what to do to protect our own mental health and wellness, and that the services can remain essential and online throughout that period as well. And globally, one of the more startling statistics as well was that there was an approximate 25% increase in the prevalence of depression and anxiety. And we know within the experience of our own island, it has been reported from the leadership of the psychiatric hospital that over the last 3 years, definitely in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a severe uptick in the number of presentations for serious mental health concerns. We're also seeing an increasing trend now, which is extremely worrying as it relates to suicide attempts and death by suicide. Something, again, that we don't like to talk too much about, but it's crucial for us to get comfortable talking about so that we can all take those necessary promotion and preventative kind of strategies and steps as well. So next slide. So one of the key takeaways that I want you to appreciate as well is that mental well-being can change over time. I mentioned the idea before that mental health is really a state of well-being, which kind of implies that it changes. And one of the factors that causes it to change is time. So while everyone definitely related to what I just mentioned about the COVID-19 pandemic, I think that the majority of us are in a better space right now, or we've had access to more services, more resources to help us improve. And if you haven't, I'll encourage our tech folks to also share that resource link again so that you can find some of the resources that you can get access to for your mental health and for your mental well-being. And so as well, mental well-being can change not only with time in terms of, distance away from a particular stressor, or having more time to build the necessary emotional and behavioral management and regulation skills that are necessary to navigate life stresses, but also with the appropriate interventions. And so counseling does work, peer support groups work, talking with someone else about your mental health and well-being works. These are all crucial interventions that we can all take and we can all access to make sure that we can enjoy optimal well-being. Next slide. So what do we actually mean when we say mental health conditions? I know that a lot of the terminology floats around out there and people don't really appreciate what's the difference between mental health and mental illness and mental health conditions. So the terminology mental health conditions is really a catch-all umbrella term that we use to refer to two things. Number one, mental illnesses, or what may be known as mental disorders, as well as other mental health states, or mental states rather, that are associated with significant distress, impairment in functioning, or risk of self-harm, right? So you will remember earlier that I mentioned the idea of the mental health spectrum. So what we're seeing here on this slide are people who are really in that red area of very poor mental health and who may need some level of assistance in managing. And what is key to appreciate here as well is just because someone has a mental health condition does not mean that they will maintain a level of poor mental health for the rest of their lifetime. As much as someone who is doing well or who is reacting or in that kind of, yellow zone can access certain interventions and certain skills to help them improve their mental well-being, so can a person living with a mental illness or another mental health condition. So it's really important to remember that there's help available and that there are interventions available to help someone who may have poor mental health or may have a mental illness improve and get us close to that green zone that we were mentioning earlier. So when I say mental illness, if we can go back to that slide one more second, mental illnesses actually refer to the group of disorders that cause significant disturbance to the way a person thinks, behaves, and interacts with others. So you can see here how this fits very perfectly into the definition of mental health. If you understand what mental health is in terms of being able to cope, being able to work and learn and think well and to interact well with others and to maintain healthy relationships, then you can appreciate that a mental illness is a particular condition that is diagnosed when you have a problem maintaining good mental health, right? Really important to mention. Let's go to the next slide. So let's break this down a little bit more in terms of mental health conditions. And we've listed 3 kind of categories here. So number 1, mental illnesses. Number 2, conditions that cause cognitive impairment. And then number 3, the neurodevelopmental disorders. So when we talk about mental illnesses, remember, this being a subset of mental health conditions, these are the conditions like depression and anxiety disorder, substance use disorder, and what most people would know in terms of what people think of when they think mental illness, schizophrenia. Really important to point out here that there are a lot of assumptions that we make about mental illness. For instance, that all are the same, or all look the same, or just by looking at someone, I'd be able to tell if they had a mental illness. Everything there that I just said, absolutely false, right? For instance, one of the assumptions that people make is that having a mental illness increases one's propensity to violence. While it is documented that there are certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia in which aggression may be a cardinal feature, violence is not really a common feature of mental illness. And it's also well documented that persons living with mental illnesses are more likely to be the victims of violence or abuse rather than the perpetrators of it. Really important to remember. The other thing I want to point out here in terms of what it looks like, I've mentioned of a number of examples here of mental illnesses, and by no means is this list exhaustive. But the reason I've listed them in this way is to show you that they're different categories. They're different groupings of mental illnesses. So while we have the mood disorders, which include depression and bipolar disorder type 1 and type 2, and things like cyclothymia and dysthymia, etc., there's a completely different group of disorders, including the anxiety disorders. So things like generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder and panic disorder, which look completely different in some ways to depression, right? So each of these illnesses will have a different grouping of symptoms, a different grouping of risk factors and treatment modalities that can be used to address them. And I think that's really important to note so that we do not approach mental illness in this kind of homogeneous way, because there's some very distinguishing factors for them, right? And we'll explain a few of these as we go ahead. I also want to point out here, because I know that there's a great interest in the topic of dementia and aging as well, that we do not consider dementia to be a mental illness. What we do consider it to be is a mental health condition because it causes some level of cognitive impairment and some level of difficulty as it relates to maintaining a level of optimum mental well-being. In addition, you'll see here that I've listed the neurodevelopmental disorders, and there's some other categories of mental health conditions, but I think these are the 3 that we should all try to know. The neurodevelopmental disorders are really disorders which impact the functioning or the development of the brain, right? So things like cerebral palsy, things like autism and learning disabilities. And of course, ADHD as well can also come into play. But one thing I want to point out from this overall slide as well is the idea that mental health conditions predispose anyone to a level of psychosocial disability. And this is a new buzzword right now in the mental health space. And it really refers to a level of impairment that takes place when a mental health condition also predisposes a person to a level of disability. So you can very well imagine that if someone is living with depression or substance use disorder or schizophrenia, any condition I've listed here, it predisposes them to a number of things, including stigma, discrimination, not being able to access a job on account of their mental illness, not because they can't perform it, but because people assume that they can't perform it. They may also not be able to, maintain a level of wellness in terms of maintaining proper hygiene, maintaining, being able to do the ordinary things of life in terms of not even feeling motivated to get up out of bed in the morning and do your chores and go to work and to do these kind of things. So I think it's really important to understand that, because it's well documented again that mental illness and other mental health conditions are actually one of the leading causes of disability globally. So it's very apt that when we talk about, people with disabilities or people experiencing some level of disability, that we also make sure that we talk about mental health and the mental health implications of some of the other conditions that are experienced. So in the same way that we, can talk very openly and in a very descriptive way about physical illness. I'm sure if I probed anyone here about diabetes or hypertension or any other physical ailment, you could tell me a lot. But we don't do a lot in terms of talking about mental health, mental illness, and the mental health implications of a number of other social phenomena. So I hope that's very clear from this particular slide. So let's go into a couple disorders, if you will, the common ones that I think everyone should be aware of, and perhaps some of the signs that you should look out for. So I mentioned earlier the idea of depression. That's what we call it. People may say low mood. People may say, I feel depressed. I feel under the weather. What they're often referring to is what is clinically known as major depressive disorder or clinical depression, right? And like I mentioned before, depression, major depressive disorder, belongs to the class of disorders known as mood disorders. The common features include depressed mood and 5 symptoms, which we call the Siggy Caps symptoms, and they're here on the right-hand side. So some level of sleep disturbance, either you're sleeping too much or sleeping too little, you feel as though you have a decreased level of interest in things that you used to enjoy. So if you are someone who is accustomed to walking every evening on the beach, or you enjoy playing football, or you like to watch a lot of TV, but then suddenly your friends or your family members are noticing that you've lost interest in this, right? On top of having a very low mood, you feel a level of guilt and worthlessness, or you lack energy. You're tired all the time. You're fatigued for no reason at all, right? Or you're having some level of difficulty concentrating at work. You're having changes in your appetite, which result in you eating too much or eating too little. And this, of course, can have roll-on effects in terms of your overall physical wellness as well. Then, of course, there's something known as psychomotor slowing. So you feel as though you just don't have that energy, and that's resulting in you not being able to do things that you're accustomed doing. So even getting out of bed is a chore. You don't feel any sense of motivation. You're slow to do everything. You really don't have that drive to keep going. And then, of course, one of the main features, or what is the more common feature of major depressive disorder, is this propensity to self-harm. So thoughts of death by suicide, thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore, actively engaging in actions of self-mutilation in terms of harming oneself, in terms of things that we may describe as cutting or burning or otherwise causing some level of harm to one's body. These are all some of the classic features associated with major depressive disorder. I won't get into the actual diagnostic criteria for it, but generally we say that any kind of period where there's a protracted depressed mood plus 5 of these other symptoms, then we might want to work that person up for a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So what are some of the risk factors? And I've listed them here, won't go through all of them, but persons who have a particular personality type where they're extremely pessimistic or they have a low self-esteem can be predisposed to depression. Also, experiencing traumatic or stressful events, which may include the death of a loved one. And well, yes, there is something known as the normal stages of grief, and then there's also complicated grief. This can actually lead to a level of depression as well, especially if it's not managed well. And then, of course, if there's a history of depression within your family or a history of other mental health conditions, this can also predispose a person to major depressive disorder. In terms of complications, you only have to think about how these symptoms can affect someone's well-being. So for instance, when we talked about having an elevated appetite where you just eat and eat and eat as a way of coping, what this can actually result in is excess weight gain. Excess weight gain leading to obesity, obesity leading to other conditions, including diabetes, hypertension, etc. You can see that connection there between mental health and physical health as well. Of course, one of the more serious complications that we see with depression would be what I mentioned about suicide attempts. And of course, this must be taken very seriously. I know, again, this is something that we don't like to talk about, or it's a term that we throw around very loosely in terms of, I don't want to be here anymore, or, some other harsh slurs that I don't wish to repeat in this forum. This is a very serious complication that requires very serious interventions. Yes. Let's move on to the next disorder that I wish to talk about, which is schizophrenia. Why I'm mentioning this is because it is this particular condition that I believe is most linked to much of this stigma surrounding mental health and mental illness in the Caribbean, as well as in Barbados specifically. It's a misunderstanding of what happens in this particular disorder that causes people to make a number of assumptions and come to some very glaring misconceptions about what mental health and mental illness actually look like. So schizophrenia falls into the category of disorders known as psychotic disorders. And the reason why we call it psychotic disorder is because people experience a level of psychosis, which includes features like delusions, which are false beliefs which are not based in any form of reality. So for instance, a delusion might be that they believe they're a god, or that they believe that some authority told them to go do this and that they're the president of Barbados and that's what they'll do. That's a very clear and glaring delusion. And there are varying types. There are persecutory delusions, for instance, in which a person feels as though there's some entity that's hunting them down. And what that might actually result in them doing is some very weird behaviors in terms of putting foil, for instance, across their windows, or barricading themselves inside their house and not leaving home out of fear that someone will harm them. And then, of course, there are things like hallucinations, which include seeing and hearing things that don't actually exist. So you will hear in common Bajan parlance, people will say, seeing green men, or hearing somebody talking to you, or this person acting crazy. These are things that are used to describe the common features of schizophrenia, namely delusions and hallucinations. But it's really important that we utilize the accurate terminology. One, because it makes it easier to talk more freely about mental health and mental wellness without the fear of stigma and discrimination. But then secondly, the fact that these are real things that people experience. And so it's really important that we approach the conversation about mental health with a spirit of empathy and care that, this is somebody's lived experience and it's nothing to make a mockery of, right? One of the other cardinal features of schizophrenia is disorganized thinking, which is displayed in disorganized speech. So they may have very rapid speech. They speak very quickly, or they have flight of ideas where they move from one topic to the next, and you really can't really follow. They have very tangential thinking. So they'll say one thing and say something completely different or completely unrelated before circling all the way back to the first thing, or they may never get back there. Or there may be this very common feature known as word salad, where they say a bunch of words that really don't make any sense together in terms of grouping. That may be a cardinal sign of schizophrenia. And so as I describe this, some of you may be thinking of a particular person within your district who is known to have a mental illness and may fit into these criteria. But one thing I want you to appreciate from this is that just because we're able to glaringly and overtly very often see what schizophrenia looks like does not mean that all other mental illnesses are that overt. For instance, there are people who are living with anxiety and depression who have what we might term high functioning depression. So they're showing up to work, they're showing up and they're maintaining a level of productivity, but when they go home in the evening, they're bawling their eyes out, or they're extremely depressed, extremely low, and no one ever knows, right? So please, let's kind of approach mental health, mental illness with the idea that it's better to be kind and better to be empathetic about talking about it, because we never really know what someone is dealing with behind closed doors. And one other thing I wish to point out here about schizophrenia is that this is one of the conditions that really varies in terms of one's gender, right? So men, we see that schizophrenia presents in men typically in early to mid 20s. And for women, it's typically later on. There are as well some indicators in terms of early symptoms of schizophrenia that can be really diagnosed or kind of picked up on early on in childhood. And actually, in very severe cases, we find that this can actually be very present even as early as the age of 14 years old. So that's very crucial to know that things like decline in grades and difficulty thinking clearly, or lack of self-care and hygiene. If we see this in our teenagers, it might be a good idea to get them screened and to help them to talk with a mental health professional in terms of making sure that everything is okay and they're not having some level of predisposition to this particular disorder. Yeah. Next slide. So I wish to talk about dementia a little bit more, again, because I know that this is something that we're having a level of greater awareness about, particularly in the Caribbean at this moment. And I want to clarify a few things for you. So often when we talk about dementia, you'll hear people say Alzheimer's, or what Bajans will say Alzheimer's, right? Not all dementia is Alzheimer's. There are varying types. And dementia itself is not a single illness or a single condition. Dementia really refers to a group of symptoms, which are listed here in the picture on the slide, which affect one's memory, one's thinking, one's social abilities. And these things actually impact overall daily living, right? So whereas memory loss, which is the most well-known feature as it relates to dementia, can be a feature of it, it really is not linked only to dementia. For instance, if you experienced a particularly traumatic event, there could be a level of memory loss associated with that, and it's not dementia. If you got into a very terrible accident or you had a very bad fall and you hit your head, you might experience some level of memory loss. That is not dementia, right? So we must note here that there are varying causes of memory loss, and dementia may be linked to memory loss, right? So, like I mentioned, Alzheimer's disease is one of the more common causes of dementia, and it's the cause of a particular type of dementia that we call progressive dementia. That is to say that it deteriorates over time. It is not sudden. It usually happens over a protracted period of years, and there's a what we call a kind of, sloping kind of um, deterioration in terms of the one's state mentally and cognitively. So, what are the core features of all forms of dementia? So, there are two. Number one are what we call cognitive changes. And this is where the mental health kind of component comes into play as well, in terms of memory loss and difficulty finding words and getting lost while driving, difficulty with problem solving, and then the confusion and disorientation. What is the mental health component? The mental health component here is that you're having problems thinking, you're having problems thinking clearly, and so this can actually have implications on your social well-being, your social interaction with others. And if we remember the definition that we mentioned before about mental health, including the idea of building healthy relationships and connecting with others, then we can see the clear implication here in terms of mental well-being that dementia can have. But as well, there's some very prominent psychological changes that can happen in dementia as well, in terms of personality changes. So someone who is usually vibrant and upbeat, and this is typically so in elderly patients, can have a drastic change in their personality, which can make them very bleak or bland, or they seem to lack any kind of emotion or level of engagement. You might also see, as well as part of this group of symptoms, depression and inappropriate behaviors. So things like saying expletives or not being able to regulate their behavior, or they're acting in ways that are deemed socially inappropriate. That may be a cardinal feature of dementia as well, in addition to things like agitation and hallucinations, etc. And so what I want to point out as well here is some of the some of the causes of dementia. So one that we have mentioned here before, Alzheimer's. This is linked more so to one's genetics. Well, there's still a lot more research being done on what are the actual fundamental causes or the mechanisms. It is kind of well known within the medical field now that there's a particular protein, there's a particular part of your chromosome that produces this protein, and where this protein is allowed to formulate certain tangles and filaments within the brain, that is where we can have Alzheimer's being caused, right? In terms of vascular dementia, which may not be as commonly known, persons who have had strokes or some other degree of damage to their blood vessels can have something known as vascular dementia, which has some of the very same symptoms that I showed you before, but the fundamental cause is that there's some degree of damage to the blood vessels. Then there's also another form of dementia known as Lewy body dementia. The reason it's called that is because it has these proteins called Lewy bodies, or these clumps of proteins, which are deposited in the brain, and they manifest with these same groupings of symptoms. So the takeaways from this slide is that dementia is not a mental illness. It is a mental health condition, or which affects one's cognitive ability, affects memory and thinking and social activity as well, and that there are many other types besides just Alzheimer's that are mentioned on this slide. So takeaway number 4 that I wish for everyone to equip themselves with as we go on this proverbial hike is that, much like physical illnesses, mental health conditions are diagnosed by mental health professionals when certain symptoms and parameters are met. So I just did a few details on 3 mental health conditions that you should probably know. There are a lot more that you can do in terms of reading up in your own time, but I don't want you to get into the habit of self-diagnosing. There's a difference between having a level of concern and self-diagnosing and not doing anything about it, right? So if anything that I've mentioned throughout in terms of mental health concerns, mental health conditions, and you feel as though you need to talk to somebody about it, it's probably a good idea to speak to your general practitioner or consider seeking out counseling, therapy, etc. Yeah. Next slide. So there is the whole preparatory phase. We went through that whole process of, getting the briefing on the hike, and then we went through what should we put in our bags, and then we actually packed our bags, and then they were extremely heavy, and then we actually hit the road, right? And there's a difference between preparing someone for a hike and then actually going on the hike and then having to experience that for themselves. And so a lot of the learning that I had on my first hike was very interesting. Number one, getting very accustomed to that 50-pound at least kind of weight on your back and having to hike up hills. Extremely taxing, right? We had to get used to the particular signals that we'd use to communicate with each other to make sure that there was safety along the way. We had to get used to the idea that, sometimes somebody else's bag is just too heavy to carry. And so they'll need a little help and a little assistance along the way. And there was this really cool technique that we also learned when we were on the road on my very first hike. And it's this idea that when we're going uphill, we all place our hands on the backpack of the person in front of us as a way of moving together as a unit, driving together that level of motivation to get upward through the hill. And we're also pushing forward people who are really not doing their best. And one of the other techniques that we also use is that if anyone was particularly struggling, as a method of solidarity, that person was allowed to set the pace. So when we noticed certain signs, certain warning signs that they were particularly fatigued or burnt out, we took their bag and somebody else carried it, and we sent that person to the front to help set the pace. And so what I want you to take away from this particular analogy that I'm using, two things. Number one is that your technique in terms of how you hike matters. And then number two, the idea that support system also matters. So let's talk a little bit about hiking technique. And what I mean by that is coping strategies, right? And there are a couple here on the slide. So if you ask yourself, when you're particularly stressed or when you feel as though your mental well-being is not at optimum, what do you do, right? They probably fit into some level of activity that's listed on this slide, right? So self-soothing behaviors. These are things that you can do to comfort yourself through using your five senses. And I'll give you an example. So something that I like to do when I'm feeling particularly stressed is to put both feet on the ground, right? And I take some deep breaths. And when I take those deep breaths, I also envision what would a better day look like? What can I do to help me through this particular situation, right? And that is my own view of my self-soothing behavior, right? So that taking that deep breath kind of enables me to engage in some level of rational thought. It helps me to calm down and take stock of what I'm feeling at the moment. And that helps me to be soothed in that particular situation. So you can utilize this as well in terms of the five senses. You can list off some things that you can touch, things that you can hear and see and taste and smell as a way of calming yourself down during a particularly stressful time. There's also the skill of distraction. So while I don't recommend this as a protracted technique, for instance, if you have a deadline coming up, it's not going to help you to put that off for the 2 weeks leading up to the deadline and then cram all that at the end and call it distraction. Distraction is really meant to be a temporary coping mechanism where you take your mind off something for a while. And there's a lot of information about the 7 types of rest that the average human being needs, including things like physical rest and mental rest and spiritual rest as well. So something like reading scriptures, something like taking time to just rest and pray and to reflect and meditate on the word as well is a critical technique that can help to put things into focus and to help you navigate particular stress, but also activities that we're accustomed to doing, things like knitting and puzzles and, watching a movie or watching a particular series can also be quite useful in terms of temporary distraction away from the stress and helping you to engage in that level of rest and self-care that you need to navigate. One of the things that I wish to point out here on this slide as well is the idea of crisis planning, right? And again, this is really where you kind of get the sense that everything that you're trying to do to cope is not really helping. And so this is the time where you need to reach out, or where you really need to talk to someone, right? So your support system for a crisis situation or for a deteriorating mental health situation can comprise of several people. It can be your family, your friends, where you can just go talk to them and say, hey, you know what? I haven't really been feeling my best lately. Do you have a moment to talk? Can you help me through this moment? Or you may want to level that up and go to a therapist. And I also want to point out that you don't need to only go to a therapist when you're at your worst, right? It's okay to go to a therapist just to have a conversation, just to talk about work, just to talk about stress management. These are perfectly fine reasons to go and seek help from a therapist. But then in terms of leveling up that care, in terms of real interventions, in terms of things like medication and getting hold of other strategies, or considering things like maybe even getting some respite in another facility. I'm talking about rehabilitative facilities in hospital care. You might think of presenting to a psychiatrist or to the emergency department if you're particularly worried, right? And we'll go through this a little bit more in the coming slides, but really important that we can all apply a level of healthy coping strategies. And mind you, there are a number of unhealthy coping strategies that people apply, things like turning to substance use, things like, bottling it up all on the inside and then reacting with aggression, things like addictions that people have, so constantly scrolling through social media before you actually sit and process your emotions, or just engaging in reckless activities in terms of binge drinking or driving incredibly fast on the road, or taking a number of risks financially as well. This can be very detrimental in terms of being a very unhealthy coping mechanism, which can further deteriorate your mental health and wellness. Next slide. So tapping into your support system. And this right here is a framework that we can all use in terms of building out our mental health support network. And you'd remember that I told you about the analogy of support system in the hiking realm. Well, in the mental health realm, it's really important that we also have strong support systems, even in the times where we're doing extremely well, so that when inevitably some time comes that we're not doing so well, we already have this process and this system in place that all we need to do is to reach out. All we need to do is to call a friend. All we need to do is to book an appointment or call a particular number, right? And so this particular framework here is built out in terms of body parts. So in your head, look for someone who you can relax and unwind with. There's some people that every time you talk to them, they're always going, or they're so distracted, or, they're always working and they don't have time to unwind. I'm not saying to abandon those friends or abandon those people, but certainly it's really important that you can have people who also appreciate the idea of rest and who also bring a level of peace and tranquility to your life. And that when you're resting, you enjoy resting in their company. In terms of your mouth, you want people that you can regularly speak with. Maintaining that level of connection and communication is very important. And this is one of the reasons why COVID-19 was such a particularly challenging experience for us. It's because we lacked that very close-knit community that we were accustomed to, in terms of being able to hug people and talk with them and shake hands and laugh with people in the way that we wanted to, or to regularly talk to them without them taking the conversation in a direction of all the bad news that they're hearing, right? So That's one of the other core considerations for a support network. Shoulders, making sure that you have shoulders that you can cry on and that you can lean on in hard times. It's also important to have people who enjoy, fun and pleasure, people who you can go out with, people who you can take a nice break with, who you can plan a nice staycation with, even within your church community. Really important that you can plan activities as well that can enhance the wellness of your church members as well. And there are a number of other activities that you can do in terms of building out your support network. But one of the core things I want to leave you with as well is the idea that we need to be open and vulnerable to having conversations about mental health. Because if we're able to talk about mental health just very glibly and very openly, it makes it easier for people to feel comfortable to reach out when they're having a particular challenge. So while it's important to curate your support system, it's also important that you are also taking steps to be a good support system for others. Next slide, please. So when to get help? This is a very common question that I get. What are the cardinal signs that I need help? So in addition to the symptoms that I mentioned before in terms of mental illness, what are the signs that your mental health is deteriorating and you should probably reach out? And there are about 10 core warning signs here. Number one is feeling very sad or withdrawn, especially for more than 2 weeks. And this may be linked to a particular activity, or it may just feel as if it came out of the blue. Of course, overtly trying to harm or to end one's life or making plans to do so. So if someone says that, they can't carry on or they're thinking about ending their life, then that's a sign that they really need help. And that's a sign that they're reaching out to you as a form of help as well. Severe out of control risk-taking behaviors that I mentioned before, sudden overwhelming fear for absolutely no reason. And this may be accompanied by things like palpitations or physical discomfort, pain as well, or difficulty breathing, significant weight loss or weight gain. Like I mentioned before, that can be linked to depression, seeing, hearing, or believing things that aren't real, excessive use of substances, drastic changes in one's mood or behavior or personality or sleeping habits. And of course, if you're having extreme difficulty concentrating or a level of intense worry that actually starts to affect your level of productivity and level of hygiene, etc. These are some very common warning signs of mental illness or mental health deterioration, right? Next slide. So I really want to take a moment to talk about the idea of suicide, particularly as just yesterday, Barbados recorded yet another death by suicide. And you'll be aware that I am consciously using the term death by suicide because I don't want us to get into the habit of using the term commit suicide or kill themselves or, all the other slurs that we use for suicide. The correct term that we utilize in the mental health space is death by suicide. Again, why does it matter that we use the correct terminology? Number one, when we say the word commit, it implies that somebody's committing or engaging in a crime. And so that carries with it its own level of stigma and discrimination. And it also makes it hard for people to open up about very real thoughts that they're having about ending their life, right? You can imagine that if everybody is always about, well, it's a sin or it's fundamentally wrong. And yes, we believe that to be true, but we also have to appreciate that there is a psychological component to this, that there's also a component to this that says that there's a biochemical imbalance, or that there's also something else going on underneath the surface that needs to be addressed. So while yes, we have good intentions sometimes in terms of saying, well, this is a sin and you should walk away from it, it may actually be more helpful to sit for a second and pray for someone. It may be more helpful to sit with them and guide them to the level of care that they need, it may be more helpful to put more wellness strategies in terms of within our churches, in terms of certifying our members in mental health first aid, in terms of learning what the Bible says about counseling others, and also how to help others get connected with help. These are more helpful than just fundamentally rebuking someone. So I know that's very difficult for some of us to appreciate, but I do want to encourage us to get more into the space of empathy, also as an incorporation in terms of our work in terms of furthering the spreading of the gospel. Yes. So I wanted to list for you some of the reasons why we don't talk about suicide, and I think you're very familiar with them. Number one is that it makes us very uncomfortable. Two is the perspective that it's just wrong, so there's nothing else to talk about. And then thirdly, much of the kind of hesitation around talking about it is that we don't know how to talk about it, or we don't know how to address it, right? And so some of the things I wanted to point out to you to help you get more comfortable talking about this is that suicide is actually more common than we like to think, or suicide attempts rather, are more common than we like to think, right? And globally speaking, suicide is actually the fourth leading cause of death amongst 15 to 29 year olds. These are our young people who are struggling with these thoughts and who are dying prematurely as a consequence of this. So it's really not sufficient for us to remain on the back burner on this or remain absent in terms of the conversation about suicide. It's imperative that as a church community, as people, as part of organizations and schools and communities, that we have the literacy and that we have the skills to talk and to prevent death by suicide, right? So one of the things that we can do to kind of appreciate it more is to understand what are some of the reasons why people feel the need to end their life? Well, number one is that they do this because there is an attempt to escape the present day circumstance. So it's well documented that for males in particular, death by suicide often occurs as a result of some particular change in their romantic situation, or in some cases, it is actually to avoid some level of consequence, be it financial or be it criminal consequences as well. There's also documentation that speaks to people wanting to end their life because they can't see a way out, or they're very lost, or they're helpless and hopeless. And this is a particular area where I believe we can do more as a church community in terms of building hope, bringing back that kind of community focus, checking in on our members, talking with them and saying, okay, what's going on? How can we help you? How can I support you? How can I pray for you? Right? Then, of course, the intense feelings of loneliness that can come again with varying psychological disorders and mental illnesses, etc., is also one of the precursors to death by suicide. So, what is our moral obligation as human beings, given the fact that mental health is a human right? And that right to the highest attainable standard of wellness is something that we should all be working towards. And of course, quality of life as well. Our moral obligation really is to save lives, to talk about it, to prevent it, to learn the signs, and to initiate the conversation if we ever see the signs, right? And so I want to talk you through what are some of the warning signs that you should look out for, particularly in terms of suicide. So quite a wide list here, but initially, I just want to mention that anything that I mentioned before as it relates to warning signs for mental illness or mental health challenges comes up again right here. So you'll see things like changes in behavior, reckless behaviors, use of alcohol and substances, etc. A history of previous suicide attempts, or a family or a friend who died by suicide, as well as more overt signs, which may include giving away personal possessions, writing letters or saying their goodbyes, taking steps as if they're actually trying to tie up loose ends and acting as though they won't be here in the future. Some of the less overt signs that we may see may include things like just detaching, right? And we may think of this as, someone is just taking time for themselves, right? But if you see that in conjunction with a number of other signs, then that's something that you really ought to be concerned about, right? Another thing that is also being recently documented is the fact that not everyone who is having suicidal ideation, that is, thoughts of dying by suicide, will actually show all of these signs. And so they might appear extremely happy, or you may see them appear very agitated 1 minute or very sad 1 minute, and then the next minute they seem extremely happy or they seem content. And it's also very well documented that towards the end, some people actually experience a level of comfort where they engage in a very normal state, right? And that is particularly concerning because it's something that's easily missed, right? And I just want to point out that I don't want to portray the image that there is blame for death by suicide. But what I do want to portray is the idea that if we can all take steps in terms of knowing the signs, checking in on our friends regularly, asking them if they're okay, and if we're concerned, helping them to get help, then we can definitely do our part to help prevent death by suicide. Yeah. Next slide. So the ways you can help, like I mentioned, there's this nice mnemonic, WAIT. It speaks to watching out. So you watch out for the signs. The A stands for asking. I know a number of people think that if you ask someone if they're having suicidal thoughts, that it will actually encourage it. That is not the case. It actually shows rather that you care about them and that you care about their well-being and that you're hoping that you can help them get some help. That is what we're hoping for, right? So feel free if you see the signs, if you're concerned, answer a question. And it doesn't have to be a very frank question like, are you thinking about death by suicide? It could be like, tell me a bit about your mood. Or, I've been noticing that you're a bit withdrawn lately. How have you been? And then that can eventually lead to, I'm very concerned about this, or I'm very concerned that you may be having thoughts that you don't want to live anymore. What do you say to that? And then you can follow that up by encouraging them in terms of letting them know, hey, I'm here for you. There's help available. I want to help you get help. Would you come with me and I'll go with you to go see a therapist, or I'll go with you and help you get through this process in terms of seeking professional help. And then of course, if you are extremely concerned, if someone has made a plan, if you believe that they're at an imminent risk of harming themselves or harming someone else, then it is absolutely crucial that you reach out to support and that you get them help by calling one of the emergency hotline numbers and making sure that that person can remain safe. Absolutely crucial. Yeah. Next slide. So I want to begin to wrap up our discussion today, and I'll open up for questions shortly by just reminding you that there is help available, right? And the treatment modalities vary, and for any given person, there may be a different combination of therapies and treatments that may be necessary. So most people start off their mental health journey in terms of getting treatment with some form of support system. So they'll talk to their friends first, or a loved one will point out that something doesn't seem right. And then eventually that person will go see some practitioner. And people enter the treatment regimen at different points. So someone may go see a counselor or a therapist first. They may go see their pastor first, right? And then that pastor or that individual may be able to refer them for further treatment if it's necessary, right? And I know that within our community, there are varying views on the role of medications as it relates to mental health. But it's really important that in the same way you can take medications for your physical well-being in terms of managing your diabetes, managing your hypertension, that we also appreciate that because a proportion of mental illness is related primarily to brain chemistry, then there is a level of impact that medication can have in terms of helping to regulate those chemicals, in terms of able to regulate the symptoms of depression and anxiety and other forms. So what I do encourage is, rather than outrightly saying no to medication, that everyone does their individual research. You talk with your general practitioner about the need for medications, and what are the impacts that medications can have. How long, for instance, must I be on medication? Are there alternatives that I can use in advance, right? And so what I don't really want for us to do is to get into the habit of discriminating or determining as well how severely someone is impacted based on medication use, because it's not that quantifiable, right? Just because someone is on medication for managing their mental illness does not mean that they're worse off than someone who is not on medication. It might mean that they're further along in their journey, or that they've tried a number of other therapies that have not really worked, right? So what I want you to take away from this slide is that there may be a varying kind of modalities or treatment options that are applied, much like in physical wellness, to kind of help here. So where someone has a knee injury, that can require physiotherapy. It can require just stopping sports for a little while, or maybe some resting and icing. It may require injections into the knee, or in more severe cases, it might require surgery. In the same way, for mental health, treatments exist in terms of on a spectrum, and they can be combined for the maximal impact and effect. But of course, nothing is done without the patient's consent, unless they are a direct harm to themselves or others. Yes? Next slide. So what are some steps, as we begin to wrap up here, that we can all take to kind of promote and enjoy mental well-being? And this graphic here shows you levels in terms of what we can do at the individual, family, community, organization, and governmental level. And I'll make sure that you have access to these slides so that you can read them in more detail. But at the individual level, there are three kind of fundamental things we can do in terms of mental health promotion. So number one is pursuing fulfillment and contribution. So I'm sure all of us have heard about the idea of practicing gratitude. For us as Christians, that may look like coming home at the end of the day and just spending time reflecting on the day and documenting, this is what I'm grateful for, and saying a prayer about that. That can lead to a level of gratitude and fulfillment as well, because we understand that there's a spiritual as well component to mental health and well-being. Of course, things like exercising and engaging in what you might term personal growth. So you're boosting your skills, you're learning how you can cope, you're going to therapy and talking about the traumas and the triggers and how COVID really messed up everything, and how you can help to gather your thoughts and to recover from that. You may engage in other healthy behaviors, like adjusting your diet and making sure that you get good sleep hygiene, including making sure that you have 2 pillows on your bed and that you're getting those blackout curtains and you're not utilizing your devices within 2 hours of sleep, etc. And then, of course, boosting those kind of psychological skills that we mentioned. So you might want to learn more about emotional intelligence, or you might want to take a mental health first aid course, or you may want to get skilled up in counseling so that you can help others. That's really important in terms of mental health promotion. Of course, families and communities can also band together in helping to promote these activities at the community centers within the church. So you guys hosting a session like this is actually in the interest of mental health promotion, because I hope that somebody will walk away from here with more ideas about what mental health actually looks like, right? And then, of course, there's action to be taken at the level of governments and at the level of organizations. So organizations like the one that I run, Let's Unpack It, we do our part in terms of the advocacy space. So we make sure that we make recommendations that, governments can apply to their policy. We make recommendations for schools and organizations, and then we advocate and get out there into the community and try to make it happen, right? And then, of course, governments know the best practices and are equipped with the evidence and research that they can apply to help, ensure that there's a lower burden of disease that relates to mental health and mental illness. Yes, next slide. So I just really wanted to close this very long presentation, but I hope it was helpful by just presenting this resource to you. Again, the link should have been shared with you in the chat. But of course, there's a QR code here that you can scan, and you can save this document to your devices as well, so that everybody knows where they can get help within Barbados. A resource that we worked very hard to prepare that includes a variety of services, including direct mental health services, as well as social and welfare services as well. So please share with your friends and your other community members who are not here. So I think we'll stop here, and I will open up for any questions or any comments that you have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. What a riveting session. This was very, very informative, very enlightening, very well presented. So thank you so much for taking the time to come and spend with us and sharing such valuable information with us. I'm sure that we all feel full. And we have a few questions. And with this crowd that we have, if there are not a lot of questions, it usually suggests that the presenter is crystal clear and that you explained yourself extremely well. So kudos to you for not getting a flood of questions from our guests tonight. So I just want to quickly get to the questions. I have, well, let me just ask this question first. I know you mentioned the whole idea of certification in mental health first aid. Do you have information on that? Like, how can persons become certified in mental health first aid? Are there prerequisites and that kind of thing for doing that kind of certification?
That's a great question. And there are a number of resources that I know are available. There are a number of organizations within Barbados that offer some level of first aid training. There are also a number of online resources that are absolutely free. I think of the Coursera platform being offered through the National Transformation Initiative. There's a psychological first aid course offered there, absolutely free, by Johns Hopkins University. So anyone can get access to that. What I'll do is that after this session, I'll kind of compile a list of links that I can send to you, and you can circulate to your members who may be interested as well. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, our next question. How do you go about asking for help if you are not comfortable doing that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Sorry, I didn't get to touch on it in this presentation, but there are layers to that, right? Let me start at the most, I guess, macro level, and then come in. At a national level, what we really need to be doing is having more conversations like this about mental health, so that we can ensure that there's a degree of openness and vulnerability and empathy around these kind of conversations. I think we all know that stigma exists, and because there's been such a degree of acceptance of the misconceptions and mainstreaming of this stigma, it's why it's so difficult for people to kind of reach out for help, because they're fearful that people will judge them, right? And so what we need to be doing at a national level, at community levels, is creating more safe spaces. I'm thinking of more sessions like this, more open sessions where we just check in, more peer support groups and grief support groups and other safe spaces that everyone can feel more comfortable talking about mental health. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we build up a level of mental health literacy. So in this session, I hope you would have learned quite a bit about what health actually is. So that means that moving on, at least over the course of the next 2 weeks, I hope that you'll start a conversation with somebody about mental health, even if it's just to teach them something that you learned, right? And the more that we build up that level of mental health awareness, again, the outcome of that will be the easier it is to talk about mental health. But say you are struggling right now and you want to reach out to someone about your mental well-being, but you're fearful that it may be awkward or you don't know how the person will react. Unfortunately, there's nothing that I can say to you to make that awkwardness go away. And there's no level of certainty that I can give to you that the response that you will get from a person will be the most empathetic or the most helpful. What I can tell you is that sometimes just having someone to listen will do a great deal in helping you to process your own emotions. And so something that I would recommend is talking with your close friend and saying, hey, I'm going through something right now and I could really use a listening ear. Do you have a couple minutes that I can talk to you? And if they say yes, and you guys decide, okay, I have 15 minutes, let's talk about this, then you can open the conversation by saying, hey, I've been feeling a bit low lately, and I'm worried that I might be depressed, right? And a good friend would ask you, how can I help, right? Or you might tell them, hey, can you just hear me out for a little bit? I don't need you to offer me advice. I just want you to listen. And you can give them the details about, maybe you've been having challenges sleeping. You don't feel like you're eating as much. You've lost weight and, life doesn't seem as rewarding anymore. And you can have a conversation about that. And perhaps that can blossom into many future conversations where that friend is able to check in on you. But perhaps if you are interested in seeking help or you think you need more help and you are a bit fearful about that, you can ask that friend, hey, I want to schedule a therapy session or I want to go talk to a counselor, but I don't want to go alone. Would you come with me? Right? Then that's a way that you can have that level of conversation. So there's no one size fits all kind of thing or kind of solution to this particular question. But I do want to say that, awkwardness, that preliminary awkwardness is part of it because of the stigma and discrimination and judgment that exists. And I'm hopeful that as time goes by, people will become more comfortable to talk about it. And so we will feel more free and less guilty or less conscious about having to open up to someone else about a mental health challenge.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm feeling extremely sad and stressed out and overwhelmed. Is this always an indication that I need help or counseling?
So that's a great question. And I want to preface this by saying, number one, I'm not a mental health professional, so I'm not diagnosing anyone. But I also want to preface this by saying that you have to know yourself and you have to know what these signs mean, right? And so ordinarily, if someone is stressed, this is a normal part of life. We get overloaded with work. We have a particularly heavy plate and a heavy burden to carry. The bag is becoming heavy and the hike is still progressing, right? So what I will suggest is that you try to apply some of the coping mechanisms that I mentioned. If you've been trying getting more sleep, if you've been trying taking more breaks, if you've been trying to relax and take more time for self-care, but that is not quite working, then that's a really good indication, not that you have a mental illness per se, but that you do need to reach out to someone. And when I say reach out to someone, I don't necessarily mean at the first stop going to a therapist or a psychiatrist. I think that's what everybody thinks, and it kind of builds up a barrier that people don't want to go do that because they're fearful about that experience. But it might just start off with talking with a friend. It might just start off with talking with a pastor in confidence and asking them to pray for you and asking them, how can you help you, or how can they help you rather, to navigate that particular challenge. But then I do want to encourage you as well that it's also never too early if you want, to seek out psychological intervention, right? So going to a therapist and getting assistance on a weekly or a bi-monthly basis is best practice. You know, if you are having challenges with your mental health and you want to get some more insight into it, I'd recommend resources like um, Mayo Clinic and Dr. Google for your preliminary research, but not for self-diagnosis. Right? You want to follow that up by going and seeing your general practitioner, for instance, and having a discussion with them. Hey, I've been feeling low mood. I haven't been feeling my best. I've been very stressed. What can I do to help me get through this? And I think, one of the barriers that faces a lot of people as well is the idea that they think they'll go to their GP and their GP will just want to write them a prescription or give them time off from work, right? But your general practitioner can help you talk through some of the things that you're going through. Most of them have a preliminary understanding of mental health. They may be able to refer you to another service. And then, of course, there are a number of physical ailments that can actually manifest in terms of mental health symptoms. So something like increasing drowsiness, something like feeling out of breath often, lacking energy, just not sleeping well, not eating well. These can actually be linked, for instance, to hormonal imbalances, can be linked to thyroid problems, can be linked to physical inactivity, and maybe you just need a stricter physical regimen, right? And so your general practitioner can be able to advise you on that, can be able to do other testing that can see, is there a physical component to this rather than a strictly mental health component? So really good question, and I hope that that answer helps.
Okay, thank you again, David. All right, so can depression lead to dementia in the elderly?
I won't say that there's necessarily a direct linkage in the majority of cases. What we do see more often is that depression actually often happens to be a feature of dementia, right? And so you'll see that in addition to anxiety and agitation, the forgetfulness and the memory. I am sure that there are other correlations between the two. But from my understanding, they're really two isolated things and they can be symptoms of each other. They can coexist. That is to say that someone may have a depressive disorder in addition to having dementia. And we know, of course, that dementia is more common in terms of the elderly. And outside of dementia in general, there are a number of things that come along with aging. For instance, we make a lot of mock sport in Barbados about the idea that funerals happen to be a place of community building for those who are elderly, right? In the sense that that's where they all come out and they see their friends and so on. But you can imagine how that can actually play on one's mind. The idea that your friends are dying, the idea that your community is literally eroding or that you're becoming more and more isolated. Even just coming to grips with the idea of death can lead to things like depression, can lead to things like grief and anxiety. And in addition to all the other physical symptoms that are attached to the natural aging process, dementia kind of exacerbates that. And I also want to point out here that when we talk about dementia and mental illnesses and mental health conditions in general, we also have to remember the carers. The fact that, carer fatigue is a very real thing. That those who have to look after patients with mental health conditions have a particularly tough job and themselves can be predisposed to deteriorating mental health on account of the fact of having to give their all into taking care of a loved one. So while I don't see that there's a direct kind of route from depression into dementia or vice versa, there are kind of some correlations and some times where they can exist or coexist, rather.
Okay. All right. A close family member passed away, and I haven't been able to process it as yet. Does this relate to depression?
Yeah, so like I would have mentioned in the slide, there's a natural progression from grief to complicated grief to depression. And so grief is something that everyone experiences for a myriad of reasons. And when we think of grief, we often think of death of a loved one, but the loss of a job, the loss of livelihood, the loss of food security, climate change, this can also result in grief, right? And well, people will talk about the 5 stages of grief, including, the anger, the depression, the bargaining, etc. It doesn't always progress in terms of naturally from stage to stage. It looks differently in different people, and there is no time constraint to it, right? That is to say, Pastor Lennox might have a loved one who passed away, and he copes with it, and within a year he's better. Someone else may have grief that shows up for the very first time 5 years down the line. Well, it's more common to have grief more acutely. It may show up down the line, right? And so the level in terms of complicated grief talks about the level of productivity and the level of effect that it has on one's ability to engage in everyday activities. So features of grief may include random outburst of crying, agitation, anger, just low mood, right? And if that is left unaddressed, if you don't go get help for that, if you don't have the appropriate coping mechanisms to deal with that, then of course that predisposes someone to developing a level of depression, whether that is depression, the emotion, or depression, the actual disorder, right? And so the treatment modalities that we use for depression are often also transferable in terms of treating grief as well. But I don't want to suggest anyhow that grief is the same as depression. It's not, right? They're separate. And depression is something that is really just is diagnosed. There's a set criteria that needs to be met in order to get that diagnosis. But suffice it to say, if you are experiencing grief and you have had challenges in terms of managing it, I would definitely recommend going to some level of counseling, joining some kind of grief support group, asking your church community how they can support or inviting them to support you through this process, and also considering more serious psychological interventions in the form of cognitive behavioral therapy and seeking out psychiatric assistance through your general practitioner, or maybe even referral to a psychiatrist as well.
Great. Thank you so much. You have some very flattering comments in the chat. Folks really enjoyed the session. So we have words like enlightening and extremely informative, very well presented, excellent. So I just want to concur with the comments in our YouTube chat that this was a very well presented session, very informative, very enlightening. And David, we thank you so much for taking the time out to come and to spend some time with us and adding the tremendous value that you added to our Family Life series. I'm not sure if you have a closing word for us as we wrap up this evening.
Yeah, for sure. Charles, if you would navigate to the rest. Right. So I really just want to thank you again, Pastor Boyce and the entire team for this opportunity to share with you. I really hope that at the end, and given your glowing remarks and certainly your questions and your overwhelming interest, I get the idea that you understand that mental health is important, that it is more than the presence or absence of a mental illness. I think you also appreciate that your mental well-being is a crucial element of your overall health. And I do hope that means that from now on, certainly that you will want to tell all your friends about this particular discussion, teach them some of the information that you've learned, and also be more intentional about your mental well-being and your overall just health and holistic well-being as well. And so what I invite you to do of course, is to share the slides when they're given to you. Share the information, and then, of course, it will be remiss of me if I didn't advertise our organization and really invite you to join us on our page, Let's Unpack It Co, on all social media. And you will see us in the mental health space very often, partaking in similar discussions. And if you would like to have us back, we would be back in a heartbeat to facilitate another session like this. So do take care, and to remember to make mental health a priority and a lived reality for all. Cheers.
Thank you too. And of course, we love to have you back to come and share with us some more. So thank you so much, David Johnson, for coming and being part of our Family Life Enrichment series. I know that you really, really enjoyed this session, and we look forward to the rest of our series. Next week, we're looking at care of the elderly. That should be another wonderful session. So we look forward to that. But thank you, David. God bless you. And God bless you, listeners, all of you who were on this evening as part of our Family Life Enrichment series. We look forward to seeing you for the rest of this series.